Okay, so once we, and again, up till now, square root of negative 25 gave us that there was no solution. What we're going to do now is we're going to replace the negative with I squared. So now when you're given the square root of negative 25, what we're going to wind up doing is we're going to basically do this as negative 1 times 25. And anytime you have a negative 1 with the radicals, again, you can take that number out and replace that negative 1 with I squared. And for what we're going to do, we're going to basically put the I squared behind it. They always want the number, just like we do 25x squared. We always put the number first. Same thing with this one. Even if it's an imaginary number, you're still going to put the number first and the variable behind it. Okay, now, when you do this, when you take the square root of 25, that's 5. When you take the square root of I squared, that would be I. And I know in the past, sometimes we did it, if we were doing square roots, sometimes we had to worry about the positive or the negative of what we're doing for this one. For this one, we're not going to do the whole positive and negative. This one, we're going to let 5i just be the answer for this thing. And here's the whole catch for this one. Anytime you use a negative, starting with a square root, your answer is going to have the I there to let you, and that's basically, it's a marker. It's letting you know that this is not a real number. It's an imaginary number because we had to make this substitution and we had to take the negative out, because if we tried to take the square root of negative 25, it's not a real number. So we throw the I in there to let us know, all right, this is an imaginary number because we had to make a little substitution just to be able to work this thing out and get an answer that goes with this. So if you're going to pre-cal, you'll do a little bit more with this in pre-cal with some stuff we do here. You won't do, I think, it seems like I can remember that you don't do this again until you get to calculus 3. So still a long ways off from ever having to work through some of these again. Now let's give you one more you're going to simplify. Let's say we're going to do square root of negative 12. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of skip, if you want to, once you start doing these, you can skip these two steps and just realize that you've got square root of negative 12. Just take the negative out and put the I squared in its place. And again, move it from the front to the back, because that's just kind of the way we're most used to seeing variables and numbers put together. Okay, so again, square root of 12, and here's where you can kind of separate it. That's going to be the square root of 12 times the square root of I squared. Then if we square root I squared, that's just I. For 12, this is where we're going to start breaking it down. And normally I would say always divide it by 2, but 12 is one of those numbers that, for me, I've done it enough. So if I'm looking at this one, I'm thinking that this is, if I start breaking it down, I'm going to do 4 times 3. And the reason I'm doing that one is I get a perfect square root with the 4. So if I square root 4, that's going to be 2. So it's 2 squared root of 3. Now if we do it like we've been doing it the last few days, you know, we did this where we had the 2, the 2, and the 3. Got your pair of 2's that would go out, so that makes it 2 squared root of 3. And I think we mentioned that yesterday, that sometimes if you're breaking these down and you see a number that pops out of it, that's a perfect square root, you can kind of shortcut it so you don't have to break it all the way down for this part. Now, sometimes when we do these, and a little bit later on, when we start working with the quadratic formula, this is where, with the online homework, sometimes they get a little bit odd about how they do some answers. Sometimes they'll let this be the answer. And then there'll be problems where they want the I here. And hopefully they'll let you do either one of those two. But sometimes online homework gets really picky about where they want this I variable. Sometimes they don't. So it's one of those that if you're doing through the online homework, it's almost better if you're not sure. If you miss a problem the first time, you know, watch the view and example just to make sure of how they've got the problem set up. Now, for tests, I don't really care. whether you put the I here or here, as long as you get the answer in there and it's all good, you know, I'm okay with how you put that in there. I'm not going to be that picky when it gets down to it. Now, the one thing that they do ask you to do when we're going through these numbers, and there's a reason for this one when we do this, is they're going to talk about complex form. And if we talk about complex form, that's going to be A plus BI. And all that really means is when you're doing one of these, your real number needs to be first. And the imaginary number, or the I variable part of it, needs to be second. So the real number goes first, the imaginary number goes second. Or we could say last. And most of the time, it's not really a big deal, but there's a couple of times when we're going to do something here, and if you don't do this, it throws off the answer for this one, so there's a reason why sometimes they do this. Now, and just to make sure that you go through these sometimes, and this won't take but just a second. Let's say that you're working through a problem, and we're not going to get that part of it today, but there'll be times where you're going to have to add and subtract and multiply and divide all these different complex numbers, and sometimes you're going to get an answer that's not going to be in complex form. So what we're going to do is give you a couple of numbers, give you 3 different numbers that you're going to get, and then change them from just your answer over to complex form. So if you have negative 6i plus 3, again, you just need to reverse the order. The 3 needs to go first, and the minus 6i needs to go second. All right, if you get an answer that's just 2. If they ask you, and sometimes, again, they're really specific that they want it in this complex form, you can do 2 and then plus, or they could even do a minus, but most times people put a plus there. You can do 2 plus 0i. Because there's nothing there for the I part. There's no imaginary part there, so technically that would be a 0. And somebody's thinking, well, what if you've only got the imaginary number? It would be the same thing. If you've got just the imaginary part of it, if there's not a real number here, you could just put 0 in there almost like as a placeholder. And you may be thinking, well, that seems like a waste of time. In most cases it is, but here's where they want you to do this, because the next thing they're going to do kind of helps you see why they're having you do this on some of the problems, is they're going to ask you to graph some complex numbers. Now, this is not going to be the graphing that we've done with absolute values or the graphing we did with the quadratic problems earlier. This is a really straightforward graphing that we're going to do. That for this one, when you have the A plus BI form, that if you put this in the order pair, the A value becomes your X coordinate and the B value becomes your Y coordinate. Okay, and that's the whole reason they have you take something like this and rewrite it this way, just to get you to realize that if you have to graph complex numbers, the real part is always the X value, the imaginary number that's with the I part, that number will always be the Y value. Okay, so let's do this. Let's graph let's graph 3 numbers just to make sure we're good. Okay, so just graphing 3 just to make sure everybody's okay here. all you got to do is just think about what these numbers would be order pairwise. And as long as you put the real number first, that 5, negative 2, that's going to be your order pair. This one would be negative 3. You have one I, so that would be negative 3, 1. That for the 4i, really it's 0 plus 4i because there's not a real number there, so 0 there is a placeholder. So for this one, it would be 0 and then 4. Okay, so that's the biggest reason why they have you take numbers that would just be a simple answer like this and rewrite it here. Now, if you're working through these and solving these, if you're just simplifying problems, you don't have to worry about doing complex form and rewriting them this way. So if we're working a problem out and your answer is 4i, that's fine. You can just put 4i. But when they're talking about graphing, then you want to put 0 plus 4i, just so that you can go back and graph those points. So point A would be at 5, negative 2. Be about there. B is going to be negative 3, 1, so negative 3 didn't go far enough back. So back 1, 2, 3, 1, that was right there. And for C, since that was 0, 4, we're just going to go up 1, 2, 3, 4. Put a point right there. So really easy graphing on these. It's just putting points on the paper, and again, the points are just whatever your A and your B values are if it's a complex number. All right, now here's another one where, and again, this is all kind of tying together for this part of it. The one other thing they're going to ask you to do when you've got your complex numbers, or when you got the numbers in complex form, is they're going to ask you to find the absolute value of those complex numbers. Okay, so when they give you whatever the complex number is, again, we'll just look at it in basic terms here. It's A plus BI. If they ask you to find the absolute value of that complex number, it's really pretty straightforward. Again, not a whole lot of work to this one. You're going to take the A value. Basically, you're going to take your order pair you would have here. You're going to do the A value, square it. You're going to take the B value and square it, and then you're going to square root that number. And really what that winds up being is that the absolute value really is more like the distance formula. That's almost like finding the distance from the center of the origin, from whatever we're doing here, down to this point. And then we're going to, if you remember doing the distance formula, you had to do A squared. And to find this length and find this length, add them together and square root it. And that's pretty much what you're doing for this thing. Okay, so for this one, let's find the absolute value of 5 minus 2i. So your A value is 5. That's 5 squared. Your B value, and again, with the negative, be careful that you do negative 2 squared. Anytime, especially negative numbers. Anytime you're plugging in a negative number, put that number in parentheses, because that will make sure you're doing everything you need to do. 5 squared is 25. Negative 2 squared is 4. 25 plus 4 is 29. And that would be your absolute value. Okay. And if you remember when we first talked about absolute values back in chapter 2, we said it's the distance from 0, and that's why we always use the plus or minus. So this one, this is just telling us that if we did convert that square root of 29 to a decimal number real quick, that square root of 29 is 5.385 there. So if we're talking about how far that away is from 0, that's about 5.4 units away from 0. So again, absolute value is just a measure of distance, so this is basically just a spin-off of the distance formula. Okay. The good news on that one is if they only give you one number like we had up here, if you had 4i, well, what happens if you square 0? It's 0, right? If you square 14, or square 4 to get 16, and then square root it, you're right back to the 4, right? So if it's only one number, it's basically that number would be the absolute value, because if you plug it in, it kind of cancels itself out there. So. All right, so we're going to do more of those, but we're kind of stretched for time, so we're just going to get the last thing we've got to do here. And one last thing. Here's where we're going to go back to yesterday. We're going to use the quadratic formula to solve. Now, here's the catch with this one. Here's where the directions should be a little bit different from what we did yesterday. They should ask you to write the answer in complex form. And if I do that on the test on Wednesday, if I say write the answer in complex form, that should be, you know, the bell going off in your head or the chicken going off at the desk. That anytime you see that lets you know, if it says anything about complex form, that lets you know that you're going to be taking the square root of a negative number. If you don't get a negative number in the square root, you did something wrong. And let's go back and kind of check it here. All right, so we've got just enough time to get one problem in. This will be the last problem we'll do today. Okay, so we're going to use quadratic formula to solve, and we're going to write that answer in complex form. All right, it is a quadratic, so almost every single time when they're written like this, you've got to tell me what the A and the B and the C values are. So A is 3, B is -1, and C is 2. If you were not here yesterday, I think everybody was here, this is the quadratic formula. Now, again, the one small thing you want to do for sure is put those B's in parentheses. Because if there's any one part of this one that people mess up, usually it's the B. They're okay with the A's and the C's and plugging those in, so I would say when you're doing this one for sure, put the B's in parentheses, because that does help when you're working through this problem. If you don't do the A and the C, that's fine, but it kind of naturally happens anyway with those two. But these two, it helps out a lot to put those in parentheses. And here's the biggest reason why. Sometimes people, when this is already a negative, sometimes people forget to do the minus and negative, where if you've got the parentheses, it makes that stand out to know that you've got to do minus and negative. So then we've got the -1 in parentheses squared, -4, and when you do A times C, you're going to do multiplication. You're automatically going to put those in parentheses. And that's over 2 times 3. All right, the minus and negative, that makes that just a 1. 2 times 3 is 6. And yesterday, here's a good review back to yesterday. What is this thing in the parentheses? What is this thing in the square root called? Starts with a D. There we go, discriminant. There we go. Again, I wish I had something I could give to you here, but I'm out of candy right now. So, all right, doing the -1 squared. That's just 1. When you do -4 times 3, that's a -12. -12 times 2, that's a -24. And when you do 1 minus 24, that's a -23. And that is and again, with the directions, when tell you if you're going to write it in complex form, that's your giveaway that this number has to be negative. Okay, now if you start trying to break 23 down, it doesn't break down because it's a prime number. You can divide it by 3s and 5s and 7s, and then nothing works there. So for this one, that 23 won't break down. The only thing you can do is you can take this negative out, and here's the shortcut you can do with these. When you're doing the square root of a negative number, you can automatically take the I out, and or take the negative out and put the I back behind it there. And now for this problem, I did this in the earlier class when we were checking something. Here's one of those times where, again, you have to kind of watch the online homework. For me on the test, I would be okay with that answer. Sometimes with the test, with the online homework, they get a little bit more picky about it, about how they want it. And we checked this one earlier. So let me show you what we did with this one. That if you get a question, and here's one that we were doing, this is the very last question in section 8. If you were doing this problem, it says to use a quadratic formula to solve. Let's say we had our answer and you wanted to make sure that you weren't sure how to put it in. Just hit the question help. Do an example. If you're really sure about your answer and you think you've got it all, just click through till you continue, get to the end. And right there, it should tell you how to write your answer. So in this case, they don't want the I at the end of the answer. They want it back in front of the square root. And sometimes we'll do that with a problem. We'll have the right answer. It's just not put in there the way they want it. So if you're really sure about the answer and you think you've got it, click on the question help, walk through the similar problem, and just see what you get here. And that way, when you go back and put this answer in, you know exactly how you're supposed to go back and put this answer in. So for this one, they want this with the I in front, so we're going to do 1 plus I times the square root of 23 over 6. And they wanted one big fraction, and then we're going to do 1 minus I square root of 23 over 6. So that would be our online homework answer. On the test, I'm good with that problem on the test. If you gave me this on the test and left this together as the plus and minus, I'm good with that answer right there. If you gave me this answer, I'm still good with this answer. So test-wise, I'm going to be a little bit more okay with how you give me the answer. You can give me the online answer the way that they do it, or you can do it the way we kind of talk about it in class before you would have to change it to something like that. Because to me, either answer is fine. It's just a matter of which way you want to look at it.